Oh, more or less here.
I think so.
All right, got all kinds of things going on today, and lots to do here. So I think we'd do well to just get ourselves going. Uh, Thanks to Diane for running off the handouts. So there are two of them. There's a brief outline, just so you've got an idea of a roadmap of what I hope we'll be able to touch on, and then there's a handout with the lessons from Mark that pertain to what we're doing that we'll be reading. Um, can read them off of there rather than try to. I didn't even put them on the screen. Too many words today to get into that. So let's begin with the word prayer. The Lord be with you.
With you.
Gracious God, we invite your presence as we enter into Holy Week and ask your help and guidance as we search to find ourselves in the events of this week, to see how our lives resonate with those of the characters in these stories, that somehow, as we find ourselves in the story, we might ultimately find you and meet the saving grace of Jesus. And we invite the presence of the Holy Spirit to be with us as we learn together. And we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay. So, last hurrah here on this. And then, like Jesus, a little while and I will see you no more. I'm going to be gone the next 4 weeks, actually. So, we're leaving for Scotland the end of the week to go see our son Trevor. So I'll be worshiping with the Presbyterians the next couple of weeks, but of Scottish flavor. And then actually going to be in Hilton Head the weekend after we get back. So I'll be down there. Anyway, glad to be here for this. And Dave has set us up with a really intriguing and provocative sermon that we'll now have plenty of ways to engage with and see what can do for us. So just what's the purpose of today? I've got it there on the handout. I basically hope this will help us renew our commitment to take up the challenges presented by the empty tomb. And without trying to be too specific at this point, exactly what those challenges might be, because they are different from time to time, different from person to person. But I want to say ultimately real. The challenges are very real for what it means to now embrace the truth of a new creation, and what do we do with that, as we'll see as we get to the end of Mark. So let's see. Can you hit the next slide there, Dave? I've tried to remember. I didn't run off a handout with a slide, so I may have trouble remembering. Maybe you have to scroll down on the left there. Oh, okay. Just yeah. Okay. Okay. There's the purpose to keep that in front of you. Let's read the story of Mark 15, 1 through 20. So you may remember when last we left our narrative. Jesus had been late on Thursday evening in front of the council, the Sanhedrin. They had tried to find a reason to convict him, but too many witnesses of different varieties, and they couldn't get their act together. And so it was off to Pilate to get the Romans involved in the situation. And that's because it's now Friday morning. It's technically Good Friday. We're not yet at crucifixion, but it's still Friday. So that's where we pick this up. So would somebody be willing to read as far as you want to read into Mark 15, 1 through 20? And if you get tired, somebody else will pick it up.
As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. And he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. They clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
Thank you. I was going to say, Dave, hit the next slide, but it disappeared. You might do that. Okay. We'll quickly move by that, but just that's where we're headed, of course, is to crucifixion. But give us the next one there. And okay, so we've got now Jesus before Pilate, and then this involves the Barabbas episode. So, what are we talking about here? I find it interesting that in the way that Mark here has described the event, it's as if Mark can read Pilate's mind, which is really pretty unlikely. I mean, he wasn't there, and he didn't have ESP or anything. So again, this is a fictive account, as we said before, not fictional, but it's more literary than historical. And so Mark is trying to get us into the flow of events and see why these things might have happened. I think it's better still to see Pilate, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, as a flat character. He does not surprise us with sudden, shifts of focus or new character traits that we, hadn't expected but are still believable. Pilate is basically depicted as an evil opponent of the whole Jesus movement throughout. And we know what little we know about Pilate. Well, not that little. We know some things historically. He was not a nice person. I mean, so any of the things we get in the story about, well, he's washing his hands or he's wondering about Jesus' innocence. Yeah, okay. There's some reasons for that in the story, but basically we need to keep in mind he's kind of a stock character, just another opponent of a different sort. Not religious now, but religious maybe in his own political sort of way, but this is now we're getting into government and politics here. He's interested basically in keeping peace. It said wonderfully in the sermon, there's now we've 5 times the number of people who are normally in Jerusalem. There's been a history of people resisting the Romans, some actual violence and so forth. So he's just trying to not have any flap. It's important, I think, to remember, as much as the Judeans there in Judea, the Jewish people, are under the thumb of Pilate, he's under the thumb of the emperor and Rome. He comes off as kind of a real tough guy, but actually he's always looking over his shoulder to know what's going on. And in fact, it was some 10 years or so, I think, after the whole Jesus episode that Pilate made some mistakes and got yanked out of his position. So, he was astute in terms of knowing what was going on. But now the Barabbas thing, the name is interesting. Bar Abbas. So get it? So the bar is like when we say somebody is Mr. Johnson, son of John. Or even as Simon Peter was Simon Bar Jonah, Simon, son of John. He was Simon Johnson, but he was also the Rock. He was really Rocky Johnson. I mean, that's but anyway, huh?
I hear music in my
Yeah, well,
house.
and he's got his compatriot Paulie, who comes a little later in the story. However, the point with Barabbas is he is also son of the father, right? Sort of small case A, whatever, and we don't know, but that would have been a surname for him. It's Raymond Brown, who's a really reputable New Testament scholar, and I quoted him last week when we were talking about the meaning of palms and so forth. Raymond Brown, among many others, really wonders whether the Barabbas piece is actually historical. You know, custom, probably yes, to offer the release of a prisoner just to keep things tamped down. But it serves a certain purpose in the story here, probably inserted to make the contrast that the crowd, who was the Hosanna gang folks, have now turned extremely fickle. And Jesus does not turn out to be Superman. Jesus is not apparently going to be the kind of Messiah that they had hoped for. Per Dave's sermon, I think they thought, oh, this is really cool. He's coming in on a donkey, and we're getting the Zechariah thing. Damn, it's not working out. There's just I think there's a deflation now by Friday. And so the contrast here is so poetically intriguing. The one who has now said finally, okay, I am the Messiah, I am the Son of God, contrasted with the son of the father, the known criminal who was probably involved in some sort of insurrection activity prior, whatever. But then, so now the chief priests enter into the story, right? They were there with the Sanhedrin. Now they've come over to Pilate's place to advocate and so forth. I forget exactly now. Let's see. The chief priests stir up the crowd, have him release Barabbas. What's your take on what are the chief priests all about here anyway? And please don't say anything negative about clergy, but I mean, they are who they are. But how do you read their behavior here?
Well, they want the state to crucify Jesus. So they have to hit that tipping point, and the crowd will push it over that tipping point.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I get really worried when we're talking about the chief priests.
Now, why is that?
Because they're Jewish. And so there's the chances of going to anti-Semitism happen frequently here.
Yes. And I want to guard against that, so thanks for bringing this up.
Yeah. There was a feminist philosopher out of Germany in the 1990s who did a whole thing about how the Jewish people were actually the Nazis.
Yeah.
And so as Christians, we should really ought to regard that.
Can I just say there was a political cartoon in the paper this morning that I found, and along this line, that I found interesting and yet kind of disturbing. It was Moses up with the tablets and lifting up the tablet, "Thou shalt not kill." And there's a person down in the crowd dressed in kind of first century garb with a head saying, I mean, who seems to me have to be depicting Jewish. And this person is pointing at Moses and saying, whose side are you on?
Yeah.
Which is I mean, to this point of, I that's really clever. And then I thought, yeah. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it runs anti-Semitism just runs really deep within white culture and the things that formed it. So when I'm reading this, I'm trying to think about a more decolonial lens. And so thinking of the chief priests as a colonized people group, how do leaders in current colonized positions at,
Mhm.
right? And so like we think of like the Morehouse men, for instance, they are doing things for their community that they think protect their community. And this isn't, so the acts of the chief priests here are to protect the Jewish community. Because they know what happens when you act too Jewish.
Well, let me just try to move this along a little bit with a couple of points. One is, as many scholars have pointed out, the language, and this is maybe more true in John's gospel, but the language of the Jews here is really the Judeoi, which can also be understood as the Judeans. So it's a fuzzy line in there because obviously the Judeans are Jewish, but I think one of the ways we cut through some of the stuff here is to say that the chief priests, I think you're headed toward here and pointing to, they're acting much more politically than religiously here. And in that sense, they've got territorial interests because they have a say, not ultimate say, but some say in the politics of what's going on in Judea. And then, as Judah said, leveraging the power that they have to manipulate the crowds. Not that religious people aren't capable of doing that, although politicians seem very, very good at it. So we can make some distinction along those lines, I think.
Yes, I would be asking for more nuance because of like this idea of power again. Thinking of like anti-Semitic themes of like how the Jews run the world and how they have secret power and all they do is crave power, yada yada. I don't think I, I I think it would be a more gracious reading to understand the chief priests and the religious leaders as leaders who are looking out for their people. It's not, I don't think it's a power thing. Because because of what happened 30 years before this, when there was crosses lining the roads, right? So knowing how Rome treats and will have at the time this gospel was written, right, has treated the Jewish population. A more compassionate reading might be like, we're doing this to protect ourselves. We're trying to be good Jews or good Roman citizens.
So without disputing that, I think the nuanced kind of tension that comes into play here is that in Mark's account, the chief priests are flat characters. They do not bring in this account that kind of nuanced understanding of looking out for the people. They are depicted as, again, flat, basically evil opponents of Jesus. So, and then we have to struggle, which you're helping us do here, we have to struggle with that way of a gospel writer telling the story to make sure we don't fall into this anti-Semitic trap. So we're trying to do two things at the same time: be faithful to the way Mark is telling the story for his own reasons, and not get bushwhacked by that into a more unfaithful, bigger picture of the things. That
I know. I'd also like, I probably like a lot of New Testament scholars think that Mark was written by a Roman in Rome-ish area, right? And like, so like Roman literature at the time, when it was discussing the Jewish people, was really anti-Semitic too. So like, if this Roman author is trying to write this Jewish story, his anti-Semitism is probably going to be creeping into his storytelling, which is why his characters are flat.
Well, that explains some of that.
You're right.
Well, let's see. Okay, can I just go on to the crowd as the last element here I want to get to before we move on? So helpful. And now, so this is really helpful to point this out, because now when we look at the crowd, we're going to easily also fall into a kind of anti-Semitic thing. Oh, well, the Jews killed Jesus. Well, as we're going to see, actually, it was the Romans killed Jesus. So let's be really clear about that. But what and again, per the prayer that I offered, as we try to listen to this narrative and find out who and where we resonate, how do you resonate with the crowd, who again is depicted as a kind of a block sort of thing, with, well, just the crowd. What do you do with that? You heard a great sermon here also helping us think through that a little bit.
Well, it's just another character
Uh-huh.
that's moving this tableau along.
Hmm.
And in a sense, you could say they are then fulfilling God's wish by pushing this crucifixion.
Yeah. Well, so we have experienced with them a fairly significant shift in their characterization, however. They came to Jerusalem following Jesus. I think we said last week, this was probably a smaller band of people. It was the folks who came with him to Jerusalem, not that a bunch of people came out, at least in Mark's account, came out from Jerusalem. And they seemed, they were appreciative of his ministry. They were supporting him. These were apparently some of the women who had supported him all along. And now we get this flip from kind of being with him to being really contentiously against him. One of the questions we can ask is, does that make them any less a flat characterization, or does flatness and predictability is that still in play here because of what I would call the fickle nature of the crowd? And then that gets me to personally a really disturbing thing, which is then I have to look at myself and say, am I also predictably fickle when things don't start to go the way that I thought I had them figured out or that I wanted them to go?
So are you assuming these are the same set of people?
Um,
Because I never thought, and I don't really think that now.
well,
Why would we think that the same group that shows up to a Democratic political rally would show up to a political rally?
because they're all politicians. No,
I mean,
yeah. Good question. I would say from Mark's account, it can't be too clear because the word is the same. It's the crowd. I don't know. Well, so let's say they're not. What difference would that make then for you as you read the
I mean,
story?
Nationwide Arena is close to the Crew Stadium. It's not the same crowd going to a Crew game that is going to a hockey game. So I just don't see this in any way connected. I think the people that were there on Palm Sunday are some of the people that may have been coming with him or along kind of at the same time, and maybe some people came out, and then I thought the other people would have been people that were liked to hang out there, for the festivities around the Romans and stuff, and that the priests would have like shooed down there like anybody else brings their supporters along with them, So yeah, I never would have dreamed that there was much crossover between those two crowds.
I dreamed that there was a crossover, but the crowd was smaller.
Yeah.
And that when I think of being in a crowd that is going in one direction, and how hard it is to speak out with an opposing view. If you're at a counter protest and there's like the big protest is Republican, very pro, in a very great. How safe do you feel? And so I've always assumed that some of the people from Palm Sunday were there and are disappointed in the in what hasn't happened, and but they're in a much larger crowd, and the stirrings of the crowd, I would think at some point you're not going to feel a lot of safety and say, oh, but I disagree,
Yeah.
You're caught up in a crowd. It's not safe.
I always kind of regarded this as Mark's way of helping to explain in his day what would have been known by his time for sure, because Paul, writing earlier, admitted that he was part of a Jewish plan to hunt down and arrest Christians, and they were authorized from Judea to do so. so that this is a way of explaining that Mark is aware that Jesus was largely rejected by the officials religiously in Judea at the time he was alive.
And I think what you've added here actually can support what Naomi is saying, yeah, and maybe partly what I was saying too. There's an interest in protecting and preserving the Jewish faith and culture and so forth, understandable and legitimate. At the same time, an interest in protecting whatever authority these leaders have to wield whatever minimal power they might have. So I mean, I think in that sense, two things can be true in terms of the motivation of the religious leaders here. Again, remembering that in Mark's depiction, they're not very nuanced characters. What if I can just go back to John for a second, what you're saying about the crowds got me thinking. I've recently been reading Liz Cheney's book, Oath and Honor. I don't know if you read that. Don't read it to cure insomnia. It'll keep you up. I mean, it's interesting. But it took me back to just what's probably most conscious for us in our recent memory about mobs is January 6th. And right, there weren't any Democrats there who got carried along in that, apparently. I mean, there were a like-minded group of people who came with a common purpose, but we also see some of what you were saying, Julie, that anybody who would have been there who wanted to say, wait, it's getting out of hand. The mob mentality we know psychologically is a very real kind of a thing. So just comment on that, but go ahead, Naomi, yeah.
I really appreciate your reading, John. I've never thought about it that way because it's never been taught. I've never been taught to read it that way. So I really appreciate your reading. That being said, I think continuing with waves that we have seen justice movements throughout the 20th and 21st centuries play out is the crowds change as they grow. So if we think about like the liberation movements, they don't start off as parades or marches. They turn into parades, and the politics of those crowds changes. Or when we think of Black Lives Matter and the protests in 2020, and how the composition of those crowds changed, and then people in the crowds started actively working against Black liberation, right? So that could be the same scenario that's playing out here, where we have a small core of people who are looking for one sort of liberation, but respectability politics starts playing a major part.
So, yeah, I'm going to try to move us on because I don't think we're going to land in one place, which is great. I mean, that's all these points of view have helped us see some of the tricky nuance of this. And I want to get to Easter here too. So, but that's good. Give us the next slide here, and so just to so we remember what's going on then as Jesus is before Pilate, and remembering that I think as who said over here, Judy, that it was the Romans then who actually make the capital punishment decision because they're the ones who can authorize crucifixion, not the Sanhedrin. We hear that Jesus is flogged or scourged, same word translated differently. And that's a very realistic depiction from the Passion of the Christ. It's important, I think, to remember this, that crucifixion was not just the nailing on the cross or the hanging on the cross. Other aspects of torture and punishment usually came into play. This flogging process was you were whipped with a with a whip that often had little metal pieces or pieces of bone wrapped in the leather. So when it caught you, it tore at you. I think this is gruesome, but I think we have to be honest about what was going on here. And there's no elaboration of this in Mark's gospel. They just says Jesus was flogged. It's as if, yeah, everybody who's reading this, probably written for a Roman audience, they'll know what I'm talking about. They'll know the flogging was terrible and so forth. And there's a real minimalist approach in Mark, actually, just flogging. And all Mark says about the death is he breathed his last. So that's about all we get. But give us the next slide. Is the icon, I think, of Rubeloff's icon of the crucifixion, which has sometimes been pointed out. It's a very bloodless crucifixion. Well, icons are supposed to help you not necessarily see the image, but see through the image to something beyond the image, which in this case is the victory of the cross. But icons are one kind of artistic depiction. Mel Gibson and the Passion of the Christ are another aspect of that, which is bloody and terrible. So I would hope we can somehow hold both things in our minds, that the cross is victory, but the cross is also suffering. And we'll try to figure out maybe what those have to do with each other. Okay, but let's see. Give us the next slide, which will get us into the story here. Let's read the next 20 verses of Mark, where we get Jesus now tortured, flogged, and labeled as a person worthy of capital punishment and on his way to actually be hung on the cross. Got a reader for this. That's the second thing on the handout there, Mark 15:21-41. Don't be shy. All right. You don't have to read it off the tiny print this week.
They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you. So the image on the left there on the screen is Simon of Cyrene, the North African. They have an artistic depiction of somebody who actually looks maybe or North African, and then a depiction of the not bloodless crucifixion. The Simon of Cyrene, who's the father of Alexander and Rufus, that's an interesting little tidbit where this there's a little bit of history dropped in here, apparently, as if I can say that because everybody will know who these characters are. Suspicion is that Alexander and Rufus were probably earlier people in the Christian movement, and and sons of somebody who was actually on the scene. So it adds a little bit of historical credibility, perhaps. You wouldn't manufacture those names if nobody knew who they were anyway. But again, we're still dealing mostly a fictive. It's not a documentary PBS, CNN cameras on the scene type thing here. Okay. But just to go to the crucifixion for a minute, I think it's important to remember some of these things. That how did the Romans execute this execution, this terrible way of promoting what they saw as justice? So Jesus is led out of the city walls, very likely naked, because that's how they were crucified, and they'd already done the bit of parting his garments and so forth. And we know from excavations and whatnot that where many crucifixions happened outside of the city wall was a place that had become a garbage dump. It had formerly been a stone quarry, the place where they quarried much of the stone to build the walls of Jerusalem, and they quarried the best stuff that they had there. Some of it was very good white limestone, so forth. The stuff that wasn't kind of up to speed, and I'm saying this, I worked in a stone quarry 3 summers when I was in college, so I have a sense of, you pick out the best. Not all limestone is created equal. Some is better, some is soft and it doesn't last, some is nice and hard and whatever. They would quarry around the stuff that didn't look as good and wasn't as sturdy, and then extract the stuff that was better. Well, give us I think I got the next images of that. Yeah. Oh, well, hold on to that. We'll get to this in just a second. Just back to the limestone thing. So what we have in Golgotha, the Aramaic word for skull, is a kind of hump of limestone that wasn't up to snuff. It was probably yellow colored and not the kind of white, more pure stuff they wanted. So they quarried around that. Well, this little hill type thing was a good place for crucifixions. Got everybody above the crowd. You could be seen both from below and up from the city walls. And if you listen carefully to today's psalm, the stone that the builders rejected becomes the head of the cornerstone. Now, I don't in any means think that the psalmist is predictively have a telescope into the future here. It's just poetry, but pretty striking poetry. Again, making Mark's point, I think, that Jesus is the lowly one, the humble one, and out of this substance that is thought to be worthless, it becomes the pivotal point in the whole Jesus narrative. Okay, go ahead to that slide then of crucifixion. So just so we remember, all the paintings and whatnot we see of Jesus carrying the cross look like, a cross like this, which is not really how the Romans did it. They would put an upright post, like a telephone pole type thing, into the ground, and that would be in place at the execution site. Jesus likely carried, as that picture of the Simon there, carried the crossbar, which, is probably like carrying a railroad tie. I mean, think about how heavy that would be. And so you carried the thing on which you would in fact be crucified. We know from other historical records, this kind of execution was deliberately meant to be, there was nothing in any Roman law about cruel and unusual punishment, other than we want it to be as cruel and unusual as we can depict it, because we want this to be a sign you don't mess with Rome. And that's why these things were public, and they were crucifixions deliberately designed to be not just physically excruciating, but emotionally and psychologically excruciating too. This is a Middle Eastern culture that we're dealing with here that was highly sensitized to issues of shame and honor. And so if you can publicly shame someone this way, belittling them, mocking them, crucifying them naked, I mean, that's a terrible thing in Jewish culture. It reinforces the power of the oppressors and really seeks to put in place the one who's crucified. I won't go into this. I've mentioned it before. I personally think the whole shame dynamic here is really significant and important when we get at what is the connection with a dying Jesus and our human situation. I think shame becomes a very connecting link. Anyway, you can tell on that depiction there's like halfway down the upright, there's a little kind of like a seat, and often the Romans would use that. They deliberately use wood that had a lot of splinters in it, so that I think it was acacia wood they've discovered often used, so that you didn't necessarily bear your whole weight on your hands. That actually would be hard to do if you had nails in your hands, but you'd have a little bit of support underneath. But every time you try to, lift yourself up to get a little more breath, that would just dig into you and be all the. I mean, these were ingenious executioners. I mean, in a terrible sort of way. The fact that Jesus died relatively quickly, within a 6-hour span, probably, if he were hung on the cross in the morning, darkness from noon to 3. So that's very fast for someone to die of crucifixion. The whole idea was to prolong the process, and often people would hang for several days, and just slowly wither away. Well, give us the next slide, I think. Yeah. The way that you died from crucifixion was not from loss of blood necessarily, it was asphyxiation. You finally could not lift yourself up enough to get air. It was like drowning in a sense. And if you've ever gasped for breath when you couldn't breathe, imagine, again, it's ingeniously torturous to put somebody through that. Let's see, give the next one here. I just want to make this connection. I don't know if this book came out about 10 years ago, James Cone, African-American theologian. It's a fascinating book and a really disturbing one. He makes the connection between the cross and the lynching tree phenomena of the lynching era in the United States from post-Civil War till, I don't know, how far do we go with that? Almost up into the 1940s, I think. And this is a horrific image. I think somebody mentioned this last week of an actual lynching. You see the crowds there who are celebrating what's happening. I had lunch with a clergy friend the other day. We talked about this a little bit, and he said, he knew from reading that, sometimes after the lynchings, the crowds would bargain for an actual body part of the lynched person. They wanted that as a souvenir, an ear, a finger, whatever. And he said this whole business of how Jesus' garments are raffled off and bargained for, it's an interesting little thing. I think we can learn a lot by contemplating what lynchings were all about and what was happening with a crucifixion. It's a mob phenomena in some ways, but clearly sanctioned by political powers. If you can see Jesus through the lens of the innocent victims of lynchings, when I first read that book, it brought a whole nother dimension to me of what this may be all about. Okay, give us another image here. So we have to touch on this, then I promise we will get to Easter here. Not trying to get into any grand theory of the atonement here, or
He's looking at me.
Oh, I was looking first at Michelle, but because if we had time, I would just say, give us 4 or 5 theories of the atonement, and I know you could do that. But just simply to say that, why does Jesus die? I think Mark says it earlier in chapter 8 that the Son of Man, Jesus, must undergo great suffering. And why is that? I think it simply means that if Jesus were at this point to continue to try to live, to call on supporters who might have made a violent response, it would simply be a compromise with violence. I have in mind where Dave ended his sermon, and we're going to get to that because I think this is really important. But I think the Jesus statement here is simply saying there's no way at this point in the narrative to try to fight violence with violence. I will resist violence. I'm not condoning violence, but I will resist violence by being the willing recipient of violence. The choices here would have been use violence to defend himself on the one hand, or change his message so that no one in power would now be threatened by him, that would mean probably allowing violence to have its way then with whoever. So we've got not good alternatives. I think Jesus steps in and says, if violence is going to happen, let it happen to me. The thing I want to really land on here, though, is that in the end, and again, to just try to avoid another problematic possible interpretation, because someone said, well, what is this thing where the Son is being sacrificed on a cross by the Father? Isn't this divine child abuse? It smacks of the Abraham and Isaac story. Well, okay, we don't have time to get into all that. I think that's a really valid point. If anything that construes this as divine child abuse has to be taken seriously and considered. I will just say that in the end, I think we have to say Jesus' death is caused by humanity and a combination of factors. The Romans, the religious elites, the civil authorities, and us as possibly part of a crowd. I mean, we're all of a kind of similar opposition force in Mark's narrative. But yeah, I knew there'd be a response. We do want to get to Easter here, so.
Every time you say Marx, I think of Marx.
Oh, with an X. Yeah. Okay.
Like, oh no, he's not talking about Marx.
No, I'm not.
Could it be that it's not humanity? That's not I hate that word as well. That is killing Christ or Jesus at this moment. Thinking of the cross and the lynching tree and the work that Black theologians have done, and in particular Black feminist theologians and womanist theologians. When we say humanity killed Jesus, there's some implicit arguments being made about the nature of what it means to be human.
Okay, but is the alternative then, though, saying, well, God killed Jesus?
No.
Okay, that's all I'm trying to say is
right.
I'm just trying to take the thing off of this as divine child abuse.
I mean, for me, if I was going to be making this argument, I guess I'm making an argument.
Yes, you are.
I would let the text just be the text, right? So, like the text,
okay.
The text reads as this is child abuse. I think the text is wrong, and that's fine. Like this is Mark.
Okay, I want to say I don't think Mark's text says that. At least not. Maybe it's more clear in other gospels, but not so much here.
Maybe not so much.
Okay, so can we just let that sit there, or we won't get to Easter?
We've got 4 minutes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry.
Easter's coming.
All right.
Yes.
So we're not going to say anything then about Holy Saturday because we never say anything about Holy Saturday. All I can say is
There it is.
that's don't it.
Just that when you're supposed to keep your lamps trimmed and
Just seize it as a moment to grieve and know that something terrible has happened and you really don't know what's coming on. Let's get to, I will forego the reading except for the very end here, which is, so when we come to the tomb, they see the young man, it doesn't say it's an angel, although it's some kind of presence. Some have wondered whether that was the author of the gospel, whatever, who tells them not to be alarmed. They went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they dummied up and didn't say anything. Okay, so what in the world is that all about? I had a whole thing I sometimes do about Charles Dickens here. If you know the first words of the Christmas Carol, it's powerful. Marley was dead to begin with. This must be distinctly understood, else nothing wonderful can come of the tale which I am about to tell. I think you can just say, Jesus was dead, and this must be distinctly understood, that the death was real. Jesus didn't just fall asleep on the cross, although there are theologies about that and so forth. Death really happened. And so, as in the Christmas Carol, if you don't know that Marley actually died, he's not a credible person to come back and tell Scrooge how to get his act together. He's actually been through it, and he knows the consequences. And so, if it empowers the Jesus figure here to say, oh, I've been through it and I know it, and I'm coming back now, not with recrimination, but to give you a mission and a new way, invitation of a new way to live. So, the point, I don't know where we are, go a couple more slides down. That'll do. The question is then, why this mysterious ending to Mark's gospel? And I think this was actually the end. The other stuff that was appended later, probably borrowed from other gospels, and they needed to flesh out the story. But I think it's intentional on Mark's with an S, the writer saying they flee. Why? Well, one particular part of this is that in Jewish theology at that point, there was an expectation of resurrection in some circles. We know Pharisees thought there would be another life and so forth. But the common expectation was that when a resurrection from the dead occurred, this would mark the apocalypse. This would mark the beginning of the end of everything. Well, the women come to the tomb and there's no Jesus' body, but they're looking around and saying, Rome's still in power, everything's still the same, nothing cataclysmic happened, there's no zombie apocalypse going on or anything. So that the issue that they're now up against is, one message seems to be everything has changed, the dead have risen. On the other hand, nothing has changed. So the question that's forced upon them and all of us, I think, is, what do you do when the end of the story is not really the end of the story? What do you do when everything has changed, a new creation, introduced, at the same time that it doesn't look like anything has changed? This, I think, is the great, this is really the Easter challenge. And so, as I think I said before, I'm finding myself, the longer I live, that Easter, although we celebrate victory and new life and so forth, it's a more somber occasion. So we got some serious stuff to deal with now. Do we really trust that new things have become possible, that a whole new avenue of being in the world is open to us, when we've still got Ukraine, Rafa, all the stuff that we know about? What does an empty tomb mean? And whether you think of that literally or some kind of symbolically, there's still power in it. That's something. The story is telling us, trust that something has shifted. What does that mean? So I just want to land on those bullet points at the end, and not, not any grand theory of atonement or whatever here. I think that our calling in the world post-Easter is not to, quote, win people for Jesus or get them to accept Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. I think Jesus probably would have gagged over that kind of thing. It's frankly just unrealistic in a pluralistic world. I think if we're embracing the truth of the gospel, the good news of the Jesus story here, that something has happened that makes newness possible, then I think the calling is to both to live life and face death as Jesus did. And here's my 5 bullet points on that. What I think that might mean. It means, I think, and each one of these is in a kind of tension. It means resist violence as a mean to combat evil. At the same time, though, you recognize that evil is real and has to be dealt with. Sometimes that means you're going to make compromises. Why did people, Bonhoeffer, one of them, thought that eliminating Hitler was the only way they could go? It's hard to say Bonhoeffer wasn't a faithful Christian. So there's a tension. Resist, but be realistic. Second thing, love God, neighbor, and self. That's basic Shema of Old Testament. Do all that. At the same time, you recognize that there are false gods, and you might be tempted to love the wrong ones. Some of your neighbors are frankly untrustworthy. They are inexplicably just nasty people. You have to be realistic about that. And frankly, there are aspects of ourselves that we're trying to love that are not really very nice. They need serious work. So don't use this as an excuse to just say, well, I got to take care of myself. If you're doing stupid, crazy things, get help. I mean, okay. Third thing, so this is really, I think, trying to get at what Dave was saying in the sermon. Strive, I think the Jesus message is strive for the proper balance between justice and mercy. You got to recognize justice should never be spiteful, revenge, and mercy should not be mere niceness that says, well, it doesn't matter. Some stuff really does matter. And how do you find, next to the last thing, life? Embrace all of life. Embrace all the life you have. At the same time, you got to go through life and recognize death is inevitable, is a part of life, and you need not fear it. If your whole life is spent trying to deny the reality of death, then you didn't listen to Jesus' stuff about storing up treasure on earth when it doesn't matter. There's no, as they say, nobody ever saw a U-Haul at the back of a hearse. You can't take anything with you. Last thing, on the suffering point, what is the suffering here all about? I think the main takeaway from the Jesus story on suffering is that God is present in suffering. May have the grammar wrong on that. And as Paul says later, God's power is made perfect in what the world would see as weakness. And for me, that means what we mentioned last. Then we recognize Jesus is not Superman. The suffering is real. There's more than just kryptonite here involved. The suffering is the exact point at where we know God most deeply, that God doesn't fish us out of the suffering, but enters into suffering with us. And that, whatever theology we do with the cross, I think that's the most profound thing that we can say, that this is God in Christ suffering with and for all of humanity. Okay, well, it took 5 more minutes to get to Easter. That's all I got. Except maybe to say we skipped over the Elijah part here. That's a fascinating saga, the whole Elijah story. Glad to come back sometime and walk through Elijah, but whatever. And you want the last word? You may have it.
I would like to have the slides. If you
Yeah, sure.
tell them to Dave or something.
You can copy them right off of there and do whatever you want. Just download that file. And if you can't figure out how to do that now, I'll do it when I get home.
Is that open?
Oh, I can do. Yeah, when we're done, I'll pull it up on that. Okay, sure. Yeah, if you want. Okay. Blessed Holy Week. I'll think of you from St. Andrews next week.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I just got to do one last little Robert Frost thing. I used this poem the other night. When you think of Jesus as sometimes called the morning star, right? So Frost had that poem, I shared it the other night, take something like a star. If you think of Jesus in that role, the poem ends with he's asking the star for advice to give us something we can hang on to that's like an eternal truth, and the star just doesn't do anything except just stand there. And then he says the star asks a little of us here. It asks of us, and let's think of this as Jesus asking us the morning, asks of us a certain height. So when at time the mob be swayed to carry praise or blame too far, we might take something like a star to stay our minds on and be stayed. It works if you think of Jesus, I think. So, okay.